Good morning, everyone. Welcome back, and welcome to this very special presentation. My name is Mark Watson. I'm the interim dean here at the Woodrow Wilson School, and it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this special presentation. During this session, we'll be discussing the role of information technology in the next phase of globalization. And arguably, there's no better symbol of globalization today than the complex connections of the worldwide computer network. Our experts will be discussing how IT will transform the global information landscape, and I'm pleased to tell you that we have with us today two of the best people anywhere in the world to help us explore future trends in the information revolution. Since our time is limited, I'll be very brief in my introduction and outline the format for the session today. First, we'll hear from our experts, and then we'll have an extended period, I hope, for questions and answers and for discussion. Serving as our moderator and provocateur, I love that expression, is Ed Felton, professor of computer science. We all know him here, of course, as professor of computer science and public affairs in the Computer Science Department in the Woodrow Wilson School, and the director of the Center for Information Technology and Policy here at Princeton. His research interests include computer security and privacy, especially relating to media and consumer products, and technology, law, and policy. Ed's research on topics such as web security, copyright protection, and electronic voting have been covered extensively in the media. His weblog at freedomtoteach.com is widely read for its commentary on technology, law, and privacy. In 2004, Scientific American named him to its list of 50 worldwide science and technology leaders. Along with us this morning is also, of course, Eric Schmidt, Chairman and CEO of Google Inc. Earlier today, I'll apologize, but I referred to you as the Google guy in our breakfast meeting. You were in the company of the UN guy who was here yesterday, and we have the Gates guy here too. Eric was recruited to Google from Novell, where he led the company's strategic planning, management, and technology development as chairman and CEO. Since joining Google in 2001, Eric is focused on building the corporate infrastructure needed to maintain Google's rapid growth as a company. He earned his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering here at Princeton, and then went on to earn his master's and PhD in computer science at UC Berkeley. In 2006, Eric was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, which recognized his work on the development of strategies for the world's most successful internet search engine company. Clearly, obviously, why even say it? Eric was inducted as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2007, and I'm going to quit speaking so we can hear some experts. Thank you.
While Eric was being introduced, I Googled the Google guy, and in fact, your name does come up. So we know that you are, in fact, the Google guy. That's the source of authority these days. I guess I'd like to start by asking you to talk about how Google made the transition from being a graduate student project at Stanford University into being the global company that it is today. How did that happen, and what did you learn along the way?
You know, it's a lot easier now because of the internet, because the internet is global. And Americans have this view that all innovation occurs within the United States, and that it's lately exported after a while to these undeserving and otherwise uninteresting people who don't live in America. And of course, we all know that America is just a very small part of the global creative commons. And the internet really is, it's remarkable as an institution that has been built with essentially American values at least according to the other countries, but allowing very rapid localization. So in our case, what we did is we built a set of websites that people just started using. And the most common question I get about Google is, well, how is it different everywhere else? And I'm sorry to tell you, it's not. People still care about Britney Spears in these other countries. It's really very disturbing. In fact, the key insight of my service at Google has been that people are the same everywhere, which I think would be the simplest way to run the world, is to recognize that the other people, other races, other cultures, people who don't speak the same language, have roughly the same things that they care about as you do. And we know this because we can prove it. The only thing that's really different, of course, is language. And the way we solved that was we got volunteer translators. We made it very easy to take our website and literally translate it into the language that you claim to speak. So we've ended up with a lot of languages that don't actually exist. My favorite is Bork, 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 which, if you recall, is the Swedish chef language. And you can establish the basic language, and all of our answers are in that subset of Swedish, as best I can tell. So part of the secret here is you get the globalization of the internet, and part of the secret is to get volunteers. I think one of the things that people don't appreciate about the global stage is people have a lot of free time. They do. They're not like us. That's what I'm trying to say. And so it's very important to sort of recognize that they have a lot of free time that can be used for good or evil, but they will use it. And you might as well give them some task like translating your website.
And people will translate websites for you.
For free.
For you, for them and their own friends.
So then the next thing you do is, since there are 5 such groups, you get them to compete to choose the one that they claim is the best, since you can't read the language anyway. That's sort of how, and so once you sort of map the art of manipulating this free energy, it works really well.
So one of the remarkable things about the internet, of course, is that as soon as you put anything there, it's global, right? You set up a web page yourself, you put maybe an embarrassing picture of your friend there on it, and anyone, anywhere in the world can see it, right away. So when that happens, you are taking whatever it is you're putting out there and you're exporting it into many different countries, many cultures, many different legal regimes. And if it's just you and your friends, then maybe no one notices. But at some point you get larger, and somebody somewhere notices that you're doing something that they don't like. And that's when you get to see another part of the global nature of the web. So Google has certainly run across this, where somebody somewhere speaks up and says, we don't like what's happening, this is contrary to our culture, this is contrary to our public policy. Maybe they're confused, maybe it's, maybe not, but you do run into these problems all the time.
Yeah, they're usually not confused. They have an agenda. Sometimes we agree with it, sometimes we don't. I would define Google in the sort of in the naive phase, and then the okay, we're going to deal with it phase. And the naive phase goes like this: we're having a good time. We have all these laws and all of that, and we put this stuff out. Everybody translates everybody, and it's going to be this, kumbaya kind of moment around the world. And the laws and the structure and the culture they're neither the same nor coherent. A simple rule. So, typical example, on the google.com website, there is information that is legal in the United States and illegal in another country. What do you do? Okay, well, I now have hundreds of lawyers who can answer this question precisely. But it goes something like this. We assert that if it's on the google.com website, then it's essentially controlled by Google in the United States and controlled by American law. We also, however, publish domains, which are like, where we do in fact follow those local laws. We've managed, the internet community has managed to convince the governments, at least in most cases, to accept that that's the answer. The first example we had was very, very early on this, where it turns out because of the despicable history of the Nazis in Germany, it's illegal to have Nazi websites. And there are about 100 of these groups are truly horrific, and they are legal in the United States and illegal in Germany. So we have a German domain which omits that information, and that's widely accepted as legal, just, and correct. The next one we had was much tougher to deal with, and it had to do with Brazil. It turns out we had a social networking site in Brazil that had some child pornography on it. And unfortunately, child pornographers, again, a truly despicable activity, upload this stuff, you catch them, they upload again, so forth and so on. And so the legal question was whether that activity, which was in a service that's hosted in the United States, was within the arms of the Brazilian law. And we were busy getting rid of this stuff. But a prosecutor in Brazil asserted supremacy. And so, okay, no problem, we have our government, then you'd think it's resolved. So then what happens is the prosecutor decides to arrest the people that we had in our Brazilian operation and put them in jail for a site that they have no control over, is not in their town, they have nothing to do with it. That was a wake-up call. So our head of the country, and these people have enormous personal liability. They have criminal liability, civil liability. And there's only something, we obviously indemnify them and all this. They obviously had nothing to do with it, something going on in the US. So this goes on for a while. So now, of course, and that one was, by the way, successfully resolved after a few years. We learned a hard lesson, which is that in the way governments work, including democratically elected governments, prosecutors have very strong and arbitrary powers, and many of them don't fully understand this complex architecture of how the internet works.
So this is of course, one of the implications of doing business with people at a distance. Even though you have an office in Brazil, you don't have people in every area, every town.
Well, in Brazil, we actually had people who they could arrest.
In
Thailand, we bought YouTube, and I thought YouTube was pretty neat. Then what happens is, it turns out it's illegal in Thailand to show a video, I've learned this very precisely, that involves putting shoes on the top of the head of the king and characterizing it in a character. This is not a video I would have picked as truly horrific, but
that's the rule.
It is absolutely illegal. And so the person we had in Thailand fled because of the secret police, and they blocked us for a year. It has since been alleged that perhaps the blocking had more to do with the military junta's displeasure with all the videos, which is legal to criticize the military junta in Thailand, but we don't know.
But this is one of the interesting things about YouTube, of course, that anyone can upload any video. And it's been a tremendous engine of free speech, of all kinds, really.
And according to many people, think it's very, very bad. It's really bad, according to these people, to let random people upload.
You're having trouble? Okay. Can someone?
Fine.
All right. We'll go handheld.
We can hear each other.
That's right. We're having quite an interesting conversation here. Sure. Let's see if this works better.
Handheld devices. You'll be our judge. Okay.
All right.
You have perfect hearing and you have the center seat.
That's right.
Go ahead.
So we were talking about YouTube and the way that it allows anyone to say almost anything, anyone who has a video camera.
No, they can say anything, not almost anything. And they do.
I stand corrected. Yes, they do. So it meets our vital need to see skateboarding dogs, as well as some maybe more important needs. But this is
the most alarming statistic about YouTube is there are 15 hours of YouTube footage uploaded every minute to the site. And I don't know the international percentage, but it's on the order of 3/4 international. So again, going back to that principle that Americans are not the center of the universe, trust me, people outside the US like YouTube too.
And so, to the extent that there are complicated rules and laws about what people can and can't say in different places, it's a real challenge for you to deal with. Because even looking at all of it before it gets posted, even having an employee look at it would really be completely infeasible.
Yeah, one of the central issues that the internet has is that there are a number of organizations that would like prior censorship to publication. And I want to come back to that as a serious point. When we bought YouTube, I did not realize that pictures were much more powerful than text at the level that they are. We have tolerated on the web really nasty stuff being published by truly despicable people, and it's tolerated because of the principles of free speech and so forth. The same video, a video image of the same thing, is seen by humans all around the world in a much, much worse light. So all of a sudden, YouTube brought these issues, I think, much more force. So right after we bought YouTube, we got sued by Viacom for $1 billion. And without commenting on the merits of the suit, except that they were wrong, one of their arguments is that, fundamentally, is that when people upload things, there has to be a check before they get published. And we fundamentally disagree with this at a very base level. It's a principle of web. So an analogous point has to do with the question of prohibited or inappropriate speech, libelous speech, or worse, pornography, those sorts of things. And many, many governments would like prior censorship before publication. A typical example here would be Turkey. Now, we all think of Turkey as a pretty modern state, but I'll tell you from a YouTube perspective, they are a seriously backward state. For the last year, they've blocked us. And the reason, allegedly, is because of a gentleman who published something which was critical of Ataturk, who, as you know, is the founder of modern Turkey. It's perfectly possible that the motivation for this censorship has more to do with the political dynamic and criticism of the existing government and so forth. We don't really know again.
Let's change the subject to another example of information being posted online, and that is Google Street View.
Oh, my favorite.
Your favorite. Street View is a facility that lets you, if you're looking at a map, get a picture of what it looks like to be standing on the street at that place. If you want to see the front of the building that you're going to be going to later in the day, you can use Google Street View and just call it up. And the way that this was done was essentially to send cars driving around the city streets, snapping pictures over and over, and then processing and stitching all that together using computers. But the result was essentially a very, very large set of candid shots of things happening on the streets of America and elsewhere. And when Google Street View first went up in the United States, there was this sort of game that was launched where people would look for interesting pictures. Look, here's a picture of somebody coming out of a pornographic movie theater. Oh, look, that looks like someone breaking into that house. And of course, if you take a zillion pictures, you're going to find all kinds of interesting things. And so this kicked off kind of debate about the implications of Street View, which on the one hand is a marvelously useful feature to be able to use if you want to navigate in a city or town that's covered, but on the other hand, involved the publication of all kinds of pictures of all kinds of interesting things. So what happened after Street View was launched?
Well, the most important thing that we did is we brought in the face anonymizer. And so it turns out that people are a lot excited if they're caught without their face being visible. And remember, these are public streets and so forth. We won a lawsuit by a family who had a funny name, which I won't repeat, but they actually sued us over driving through their public street and taking a picture of their house. And we won that because it's a public street. And we try very, very hard to do this. We have an internal video of a Street View car. These are little Priuses, by the way, that have, it's Google, right? And they have little cameras on the top, and it goes, this particular one goes into the guy takes a wrong turn into essentially a water treatment plant in Chicago, and people go berserk. And he leaves the Street View camera running for the 8 hours that he is detained, inspected, hauled in by the police, hauled in by the FBI, so forth and so on, because they don't believe that all he's doing is driving his little Prius around with the little camera. Last week, one of our cars was driving through a small village in England, and there was a barrier set up by the local population who blocked the car. A very friendly Street View driver just sat there for a while. And they gave a speech about how they didn't want modernity to arrive in their town. So again, we're on the edge of this question, right? And the reason we take such a strong position is that Street View is our most popular, in terms of growth right now, property. People love using Street View to figure out where they're going, what they're doing. So there's clearly value being provided for the mass.
On the whole, services like Street View, and indeed the basic technology trends behind them make it much cheaper and easier to gather and store a lot more information. Information that people are interested in, and most of what people are interested in is information about what's happening out in the world and information that involves other people. And so there's an inherent pressure on privacy that happens because of this technology, Street View being an example, not that you set out to do anything.
Well, what's interesting about Street View is precisely not about violating people's privacy. And if anyone complains about anything in Street View, we do our very best to take it down, as long as it's not a picture of, the Eiffel Tower, right?
Sure. But I guess my point was that in trying to build this feature, you inevitably ran across privacy issues, and you had to think very carefully before the product went out and after about how to handle this privacy issue. And I think companies in the technology field are more and more spending time thinking through privacy implications of what they're doing in a way that companies in a lot of other businesses don't have to do as pervasively.
We do, and we are, and that's exactly right. And I think privacy is an evergreen issue for the internet. You're going to be having conferences on privacy for the next 50 years, because people are obsessed about what other people are doing and whether what they're doing is correct, legal, appropriate, and they're also obsessed about their own image, public and private. And that's true for 7 billion people, because people are the same everywhere. I think the best current example of this is a product called Latitude that we released a couple weeks ago. And I'll tell you the story of how this came out. So I'm sitting in the usual product review room, and we have all the executives, Larry and Sergey and myself, the other senior executives doing, and we do product reviews, for days on end, because we're basically a product company. And this 22-year-old comes in to demonstrate his new accomplishment, and he shows a map, and he shows his current position on his mobile phone, and he shows the current position of his friends, and he's figured out a way to calculate not just the real-time position of where he and his friends are, which of course he's logged on our servers, but also he can predict how to meet up with them. And as he does his demo, I'm slowly sinking in the chair, because it's obvious that he has no clue what he has just invented. And of course, everyone else in the room goes, "Oh, that's so neat." And I'm going, you have real-time tracking that you're storing in our log files anywhere in the world with an accurate predictor of where the person is going. And everybody goes like, "What's your problem, Eric?" And I said, "Can you start with the lawsuits?" Okay. So think about if it were true that we had such real-time log information. I'm ignoring the privacy issues. Just imagine the number of police and legitimate business, government organizations, and perhaps some illegitimate ones as well, wandering through, giving us subpoenas or going into other countries and jailing our people and so forth, to get all this information. Because it's incredibly useful if you're trying to, quote, catch terrorists, unquote, or catch criminals, unquote, or persecute people you don't like, unquote. Whatever it is your government does. Right? There's a spectrum, as we know. So eventually I won that argument, and so it was agreed to do an internal test, which I also then blocked. Because they said, okay, so now we're going to have lawsuits inside of our company over employee behavior and so forth. So eventually, the 22-year-old, who's now like myself into, you don't appreciate the brilliance of my invention. We made a change, which is very easy to understand. with latitudes, you can turn it off. It's very important to have an off button. And also, you can tell it to tell people that you're somewhere else, right? QED. Now, from his perspective, that would never be needed. So we're sitting in the board meeting last week, and one of the board members says, "Where's Jonathan?" And I said, "He's at the Wailea in Hawaii." And the board member, and we're obviously not in Hawaii. And the board member goes, "How do you know this?" I said, "Real-time tracking, there he is." The next day, we got a note from a nice lady who had been mugged in San Francisco, who reported on the great use of latitudes when you leave it on in your purse and tell the police where you are. So these things go both ways. And that's a good example of how we fought through the invention by the 22-year-old and then its ultimate application to something which is also incredibly successful.
I think this is a good illustration of what often happens in discussions about these products, and sometimes in the public policy discussions as well, that we now have access to this wealth of information that we didn't have before. And it might not be so difficult technologically to build a product like this once you get the idea. The hard problem turns out to be figuring out what you actually want to do, how to housebreak it.
I should say that the one that is actually the most serious of all are called search logs. And when Google was founded, Google maintained search logs forever. And it was obvious to me that there would have to be some restriction on that because these logs can be used against you. In the United States, we have something called the Patriot Act. There's also a successor called Patriot 2, which can be used by a secret court. This is all legal in the United States. We do occasionally, at least anticipate getting such subpoenas, and through normal business even, et cetera. And in other countries, of course, it's far worse. So the question was, how do you balance the interests of legitimate governmental interests, and there's obviously a legitimate interest, and the most extreme privacy concerns. And we ultimately said there must be a number. And as an operator, we're going to be regulated in this case. So it turns out the European Data Privacy Commission and the European Commission simply settled on a demand to us for 18 months. So we just said yes.
So
that's an example.
Or retain that data for 18 months?
And then at that point, we actually don't delete it, we anonymize it. We anonymize it. And this, what I'm saying here is completely publicly known. We've described the details and so forth. And it's taken a lot of steam out of the system. So again, I offer that as another example where the technology people think that it's because disks are plentiful and it's so easy to log everything, we might as well keep everything. And you never know when that stuff might actually be useful. So for example, we can use historical logs to improve our algorithms. And so there's a legitimate business reason to retain those logs, at least from a technological perspective. But logs retained forever create all sorts of long-term issues.
To what extent do these privacy issues sort of limit your ability to get new business? So if I were to put on my provocateur hat, I might say that I'm a little scared of all the information that Google has about me. You see all my email, things that I look up and read, you store my calendar, and all kinds of other things about what I've been doing. Now, I'm maybe personally not so worried, but I think if Google fell into evil hands, I would be pretty concerned about what happens with all that data.
We have a rule of don't be evil.
Oh, okay. Never mind then.
You know, we're computer scientists, right by rules. You're a computer scientist, you understand. The serious answer, I think, is that the entire relationship that Google has is based on the trust of our end users. If we were to do something that would violate your trust, a reporter, you as an individual, a reporter would find you, and they would make such an enormous storm that we would lose, 3/4 of our users within a week or two to all of our competitors, because we've set such a high standard for ourselves. So we take it so seriously that we've had a couple cases where the government has given us subpoenas, which we've actually fought. Thank heavens for the judiciary in our country, which we've actually fought and won. So you really want to fight for the right of privacy within the context of what I'm describing. And if you're not willing to fight for it, then you shouldn't be in this business. And and just to be incredibly blunt with people who may be confused about this, whether you're using Google or not, your email system is subpoenable. Right? And in fact, the majority of the activity in police sections now appears to be going through people's email, because criminals use email. It's obviously terrible to be a criminal. They use email. And you should not assume you should not assume that you have absolute privacy unless you're willing to use basically a chalkboard inside of a room, with no windows. It's just not fundamentally there. These systems do tend to retain information, and the solution is just don't commit a crime. It's the easiest way to solve that problem.
In fact, even if you are in a room with a chalkboard, even if you're, say, sitting out here in the audience with the camera not pointing at you, you're in fact living in a different world from an information privacy standpoint than you were a few years ago. Because it turns out that people like me have cameras in our pockets, and all kinds of things get recorded, and recorded, audio recorded, video recorded, and snapped as pictures, and then republished. That wouldn't have been in the past. So we are living more in a fishbowl, even if we're low-tech people now.
And I think technologically, I assume everyone here has a cell phone on them. Everyone I know has a cell phone or a mobile phone, an iPhone, an Android phone, what have you, BlackBerry. And if you think about that device, it has a 3 megapixel or greater camera. It has a CPU in it that's more powerful than the CPU that I used when I was here as a student, which is sort of amazing. It has more memory as well. It has the ability to do pictures, and in many cases can now do a video. There are more photographs taken in mobile phones than there are in cameras. Soon there will be more videos taken by your handheld devices and so forth. It has a GPS, and even if it doesn't have a GPS, we have software that can simulate a GPS using cell tower information, which is really, really neat. Oh, and by the way, I forgot, it's also useful for phone use, which is its least interesting use. So, and we can talk about browsers and so forth. That change is a truly revolutionary architectural change, because it means that people are carrying around these phenomenal computing resources with them that are hyper-connected. In my case, I like history, so when I walk down the street in New York or here in Princeton, it should be possible for it to tell me the history of each of the buildings as I walk by, right? Why not? Google has the information, the phone has the GPS, it's not doing anything, right? Just sitting there, and then occasionally I say, oh, what's going on at Charter Club? Boom. There's the history of Charter Club or what have you, or when was Cannon Club converted to a university facility or something. My point is that people live in very local contexts, but now you have Encyclopedia Britannica streaming to you every day. And I'm using the history example because that's the mildest example I can think of. Think of the combination of the phone and face recognition, where I bring up, and Ed, you were very careful to hold up your phone. Using modern technology, you might have scanned the audience, done an immediate face recognition. It would have told you every person in the audience, even though we don't have their name tags. That's when it gets scary.
Very useful. The killer product is the one that will sit on your lapel in a cocktail party and tell you who that person is.
I hadn't thought about building that one, but now they suggest it.
On the subject of mobile phones, another big implication of mobile phones is in the developing world, where you have a lot of people who don't have access to the kind of computers that we might have on our desks, where you might not have the wired internet infrastructure, but where a lot of people have these mobile devices that are ever more capable, that will become their portal to the information highway. And you see companies like Google moving aggressively to get their services onto mobile phones. But maybe you could tell us something about what you see happening in the developing world via the wireless infrastructure, and generally about technology taking off in the developing world?
One of the things that I'm proudest of is something that we have almost no day-to-day concept of, which is the arrival of another billion people into the modern communications network over the next few years. The deployment of these very low-cost wireless networks. For many, many reasons, the basic connectivity, the basic SMS messaging that we've taken for granted here has in the last 3 or 4 years finally become available to people who don't have televisions, have never made a phone call, through a combination of microlending and the other kinds of things people here know about. And the fact of the matter is people like to talk. It's true even there. And so this means this platform, which today is largely SMS or short message based, is just ripe for the next generation of what are called feature phones, which are now becoming available at price points in the $30 to $50 to $70 range, which is low enough that they can be subsidized into those markets. And all of a sudden, they can get basic connectivity and basic things. Now, you sit there and you say, oh, they don't care, they're just poor, they're just living in their little huts. Typical sort of American reaction. If you're a farmer and your wealth is determined completely by agriculture prices and whether the current temperature and weather, that SMS message determines whether your family lives or dies or whether you have to sell the cow in order to get through a bad winter. So we think of this stuff as essential. For them, it's fundamental to get that kind of information. There are many examples in markets where people will be on a ship near a town, and they used to get ripped off because they'd go to this dock and they would get a non-war price for their goods, and now they can text to get the optimal price, and they've all been able to globalize their information. There was a food shortage about a year and a half ago, where one of the alleged reasons was that all of a sudden the arrival of this information had caused people to discover that they wanted to disintermediate their suppliers because the suppliers were ripping them off.
So certainly, everyone can find some way to benefit from increased availability of information, but the people who have less information available to them already are the ones who perhaps gain the most from being connected.
And we complain about the recession here, but let me tell you that we've got it good compared to people in the third world whose export markets just collapsed, and where the minerals boom, which so fueled their economic growth over the last 10 years, has also just collapsed. So again, this is not a matter of humor, and although it's fun to talk about, the fact of the matter is that these tools are now essential for them to recover any form of economic growth.
So as people in the developing world become increasingly connected to the global information networks, how do you think this will change the way that we in the developed world look at the developing world?
Well, one of the other principles is that there's a lot of injustice in the world, and we're blind to it. And you see this now with these horrific YouTube videos of women being beaten for violating the alleged laws of the country. And when will humanity say enough is enough and that kind of indignity is not okay? The fact of the matter is that the ubiquity of recording devices and the ability now to publish them really does serve as a check and balance, in my view, on despots. The analogy is in the 1970s, Ted Turner was the first person to cleverly use the advent of commercial satellites to create a global television network, which then allowed the coverage of horrific state actions, and you'll remember, you know them all in the 70s and 80s. That served as a check and balance against the grossest and most horrific state actions. Now we have the ability, using private communications, to serve as a check and balance against at least the societally sanctioned horrific local actions. What I worry about is that we're still locked in this old zeitgeist. Cuba being the current example, it's illegal for us to have any business connections whatsoever with Cuba, and yet if there's any group that could benefit from fax machines, personal computers, and bringing them into the modern world, it would be the citizens of Cuba, who would then immediately discover that the people who are running their country should be overthrown. Seems obvious. If you were a dictator, and I hope none of us are, and I certainly am not going to be, the first thing that you would do in a country is you would take your tanks and you would encircle the boundaries of the country, you'd shut off all communication, and you'd make sure that no one could see what you were doing. The internet is organized to prevent that. The internet is precisely organized to not allow those kinds of activities. And so people who say, well, we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do that, the way you invade these countries is with information. And that information from their perspective is an invasion, and from our perspective, it allows a leveling of expectations and of humanity.
This, I think, is a good point to open it up for questions.
Okay, my name is Yulia Amosov. I'm an alumni and an Android developer.
Even better.
Yeah, and I was kind of trying to take signs about what's going to happen to Android and my business throughout this talk. And not having heard the word a single time, I'm kind of getting a little more disappointed. So the question I have is...
What are you disappointed about?
Well, to begin with, I have been watching what phone you have in your right pocket, and it doesn't look like an Android phone. So my question is, you have an absolutely wonderful technology, a great toy, a very flexible one, that can simply level and devastate the mobile market as we know it. Do you plan to dedicate more resources, more funding, and better management to the problem you have right now?
Nice to meet you. So for the background for the people in the audience, Android is an open system operating system that we developed for mobile phones, and it is by far the best Linux-based platform for mobile phones. We did a partnership with a company called T-Mobile, which has done very, very well. And in the next few weeks, there'll be a whole bunch more partnerships being announced. As part of that, we have a developer program, sounds like you're part of that, where applications can be built on top of it. This will be the year when a very large category of phones, both small phones, large phones, touch phones, non-touch phones, will be available on Android. And what's interesting to us about Android is that most of the phones that are delivered are ones we don't even know about. And that's the promise of open systems. So the answer to your question is yes, we are doing a significant investment increase in engineering and support. Between now and September, which is this year, you should see a lot more partnerships.
There's an interesting issue here, I guess, which we might want to draw out for those who are maybe less familiar with the technology development landscape, and that is the role of open source technologies and the way that when even a large technology company is rolling out a product, they rely on building a community of people to turn a product into a really useful ecosystem that people can use. And Android being an example of that, right? Google didn't set out to build a packaged mobile phone with a fixed set of services, but instead to enable people like this gentleman to help make a really more interesting environment happen. And when you do that, you are not 100% in control of what happens with your product.
So there's, for those of you who don't know the details, in the open systems world, what happens is you release the software with a license that generally allows people to do whatever they want. And sometimes they change it in ways you don't like, but in many cases they follow your lead. And that's the balance that we're trying to strike. It has worked incredibly successfully for the web. And for those of you who are familiar with web architecture, the predominant web server architecture is based on an open system platform. All the licensing came out of that. So this is a very web-centric approach.
Back over here, please.
Sorry, yes. You mentioned how YouTube has become very powerful, that you sort of didn't really get how the impact of the video or the picture versus the text. You didn't quite see how powerful that was. And you sort of suggested it's so great for free speech and whatnot. Well, that's certainly true. The last political cycle, we had a scenario where it's admitted by many candidates that they were inclined to say less interesting things on the campaign trail for fear that it would find itself in video format. Quite frankly, from here on after, would be less inclined to say something controversial, fear that it might. So my point is, it cuts both ways. The ubiquity of this technology, when it comes to thought leaders who may not want to, publicly press or push the envelope here or anywhere else, we might end up just getting, bullet.
Let me repeat the question for those of you who aren't here. The question was about the impact of YouTube, especially on politics, and the concern that the fact that things can easily be videotaped and put up for the whole world to see might make speakers, especially political speakers, very cautious, and therefore lower the quality of political discourse.
Well, if caution means they stop lying when they say one thing in one place and one in the other, then I want to distinguish between private behavior and public behavior. I think everybody here understands the value of privacy, private behavior. We're not talking about that. For years, I had thought and had said publicly that there would be an election that would be determined by the internet. And it turns out it was 2006. And if you go back to then, which is, we have such short memories around here, the House, primarily due to the war issues, became Democratic, but the Senate was not going to become Democratic. And there was a seat in Virginia that was in play, and it was close. And the incumbent was George Allen. And a young gentleman caught him saying a racial slur word, apparently by intent, not randomly. And then that was used in Virginia, which has a history of such, concerns over such things, and it on the margin switched to a conservative Democrat, which then switched the Senate. Switching the Senate changed the political dynamic for President Bush in a very, very fundamental way in our system. So small things like that can have a huge political repercussion. When Nancy Pelosi then took over the House, she tried to have her closest collaborator become, I think, the whip or something like this. And this is a person who'd been in the Abscam, is a Democrat, who'd been in the Abscam scandal, and a video surfaced of his testimony on the internet, which became so concerning to everyone that he lost his appointment. So if you're a public figure, the reality, and they've now all learned this, as you said, you have to be careful not to play one side or the other. You need to be careful not to commit any crimes, stuff like that. And I think it's reasonable for us as citizens to expect our politicians to say coherent things in the same places, and also not to pander. And there's a history in America of politicians pandering to one group and then saying something different, and now we can check that. I'm very optimistic on this from a governance perspective.
We see a similar issue, actually, for many of our students with regard to Facebook, right? The students all have Facebook pages, and they all put things on those pages that they're willing to show to people now, and 20 years from now, they may regret some of the things that are...
By the way, I have a solution. You have a solution?
I
think there should be a law that you can change your name at 21. Wasn't me. Right, I don't look like that anymore. Different person, different name.
Great. So I'll be back to you next week with the algorithm for connecting those names up. No, one of the interesting things we see this with Facebook, and when I talk to students about this, sometimes in a are you sure you want that on the net conversation, and sometimes just generally, what they say is, look, you old guys don't understand, and the norms will be different when we are 40 and 50, and when I or someone like me is appointed to some government position. The norms will be different, and people will be forgiven, not only the knowledge that there were youthful indiscretions, which we've dealt with for a long time in public life, but vivid video evidence of them.
So if that's really true, then why is the vetting process this year, which is presumably the most liberal of all the years in the last 50 years, the roughest?
Well, that's politics.
So it's also also possible that the inverse will be true, and that 20 or 30 years from now, it'll be even more vicious because people will have an even worse summary of what people did because no one is perfect.
It could be. These days, right, these days memories of what happened back in the 60s and 70s are maybe a little vague.
Well, mine certainly are, and I was here.
At this point, Google does not charge for all of these wonderful services. You're adding a lot more, the Picasso, et cetera. But do you foresee in the near future or in the long-term future that that will change, or will ad revenue continue to?
It will not change.
Wonderful.
I give you a shorter answer, which is no.
Up near the back in the woman in the red shirt.
Carol Conway, MPA 79. I'm interested in this tool, the use of the phone thingamabob as a further tool for research in medicine. And I told Pat about 10 years ago, it'd be great to have a handheld device with even a sensor on it. And you'd be able to hold it and click at something, sort of like your history, walk down the street, get the history. And you know what this organ is that you're looking at, or this plant, or some sort of device. It would be kind of hyper-research, hyper...
There's actually a group doing that. It's called the Barcode of Life. And what they're trying to do is to come up with essentially a UPC code for the genetic structure of every living organism. And they've developed a sensor which can actually do precisely what you described. So, yeah, and if you use Google, you'll find all the details.
I should look to the left and call on someone over here, here in the blue.
Google's worldwide market share in search has grown roughly, based on the stats I've seen, about 1% a month over recent years. And so my question is, do you see a natural limit to that?
Yes, percentages have limits.
Way in the back.
Let me ask this question. Go ahead.
No, it's a trick question. It has to do with, do you see any concerns or issues about monopoly in the future?
The question is about asking Eric, does he see any concerns or issues about monopoly in the future?
Yeah, we don't necessarily confirm that number, so that's somebody else's opinion on our market share. We have high market share in some countries, we have low market share in others. We argue very strongly that we are one click away from losing everybody. And so it's possible to have high market shares, but still be highly competitive. And that's both my personal opinion and our legal position. And the simplest answer is that we try very, very hard to not lock people in. We looked at Microsoft and other historical examples and wrote an internal policy about how to be good while being big, right? How to avoid being evil, essentially. And the simplest rule is we won't trap your data. So if you become dissatisfied with us, you always have the opportunity of leaving and going to a competitor.
Having been involved in some previous technology antitrust issues, let me comment on this as well. I think you have a problem when you have not only a high market share, but also you have some kind of barrier to entry or lock-in, which makes it hard for customers to go somewhere else, should be a problem. And then also when you have some bad behavior. So one can imagine situations developing in the technology field going forward where that happens. But I think you'd have to make a sort of detailed argument for these other elements as well before Google were to get in antitrust trouble.
Hi, I'm Chen, an undergrad in the economics department, and I was just wondering what you thought about how people claim that as more and more people spend so much time on the internet and less face time and become maybe even more socially disconnected than they have in the past, and what kind of Google thinks about.
The question is about whether people spending more time online and having less face time become disconnected from each other.
You probably don't remember the book Bowling Alone. But the book bowling alone is clearly false, because we are more communicating, we're more together, we're more social, we're just social in these odd ways. And from my perspective, the current text-based communication mechanisms, which is what you're referring to, are just a transitional communication mechanism to much more interpersonal communication with pictures, movies, real-time video conferencing, that kind of thing. And so, you know, the 160 character limit of SMS is just a technological artifact, something which will be gone, you know, very soon. So from my perspective, the simplest answer is that people are spending more time communicating in different ways. And I think that, again, we tend to talk in the negative context. But think of it as there's an explosion of communication. There's not just an increase. And you do that when you use a Facebook information, or you use Twitter. And especially think about it for somebody who's not grown up in our rich part of the world.
One of the changes we've seen in the way people communicate with these technologies is a movement from synchronous to asynchronous communication. Synchronous means we are here together, we're talking at the same time. I speak and you hear me at the same time. We go back and forth in real time. Asynchronous means I write something, I send something, I put something on my Facebook page, and you come and look at it later. And so we do see, as Eric said, a tremendous amount of communication going on, but we're seeing a change in the mode of communication, and that does change social interactions in some sense. But it's still true that the thing that people want to do most of all is talk to other people, communicate with other people. And that's what they're primarily using these technologies for.
Look at the rise of Twitter, for example, which is, what am I doing right now?
There's a concern in the newspaper industry that organizations such as Google repackage news and provide it free. Thus, the newspaper doesn't have a source of income, it goes out of business, and the very collectors of the news that you are then repackaging and sending out will disappear. How can Google respond to that concern that newspapers such as Boston Globe may just disappear?
The question is about what's happening to news and newspapers especially, and concerns about the vanishing newspaper, and what Google says and thinks about that.
There's been a lot of discussion of this recently. I think the recession has really brought this issue to the fore. Newspapers are suffering from three different problems, right? One is the rising cost of newsprint. Another one has been the loss of classifieds, and the third has been the loss of advertising revenue, primarily, by the way, from autos, and especially in local markets. So it's very severe. We use newspaper content with their permission. And so the first part of our answer is always, if the newspapers don't want us to, as you say, republish or make available copyrighted information that they own and control, it's trivial for them to put some information that would block us from doing that. In every case, they have chosen to give us that information in return for us sending web traffic to their sites. Because so many people come to Google looking for information, we send it to their site, which they can then monetize. So the rough analysis of the problem is that the money that they're getting on their websites does not make up for the loss of revenue from print circulation. And that's not a problem that we know how to solve. We have ideas about how to make the online news more effective, and we're working on those, but we fundamentally don't have any good insights about the other problems.
We had a conference last year of the future of news in the age of technology. And my takeaway from that was that the transition that's happening, the challenges to news gathering and newspapers especially, basically boil down to two problems. One is that newspapers now face a lot more competition. You don't have to read the one paper or the two papers that are in your town. You can read whatever you want. And that means that, that there is a lot more competition, and therefore the price is likely to go down, meaning less revenue for individual papers. The other problem is that the traditional newspaper was a bundle of different things. Different components, some of which were cheap and easy to make and also profitable, say sports, the sports section, and others which are expensive and not as revenue enhancing, say investigative reporting. and the sports piece of the newspaper was subsidizing the investigative reporting part, but they were distributed together. Nowadays, people go to different places to get those different components. They get their sports from a lot of different places. And the result is that the parts that were profitable in subsidizing the sort of hard news can no longer do that. So I think there's some basic economic changes that are happening and would happen regardless of whether Google or anyone or any other particular company was around. Down here in the front, you've been patient.
First off, thank you for the transparency that Google has provided recently with the data centers and the fact that this video will probably go on YouTube. Some of us do watch them.
I guarantee it.
And of course, the push for social change Google operated in the 2030 plan. My question is, text search has been paying for all of these things to the tune of roughly $20 billion. And about like last week or so, there was a report that came out that said that YouTube is basically costing you guys 5%, $500 million. I wouldn't ask you to substantiate that, but my question is, when are we going to see the next type of ad, the geo ad, that people have been talking about?
The question was about revenue and also about how when are we going to see geo ads, meaning ads that are targeted based on where you are.
So that you think that those geo ads would be useful? We, today Google's, the vast majority of our revenue, 96, 97%, is related to the text ads that you see. So if you type digital camera in, you'll see ads in various combinations on the top and on the right-hand side, and they'll pay for Google. So when you asked earlier, will it remain free, that's, where's the money coming from? It's coming from there. And by the way, it's a good business. So the other businesses that we're in are a fraction of that. In some cases, they're going more quickly, but they're not as profitable, or they take longer, or they take more investment. So if you're going to have a core business, this is the one to have. And that gives flexibility to have a good business and yet also have a lot of these other things. So we can afford to build businesses, lose money at them while we're building them. In the case of YouTube, we are in the process of building video advertising systems, which we believe will ultimately provide enough revenue not only to cover the costs of YouTube, and more importantly to pay for the professional content, which is this issue, is fundamentally the issue with the newspapers. We want to pay for that professional content. We are codependent with them. So from an ads formats perspective, the most important new set of ads formats that we're doing are called display ads. And these are essentially picture ads, where the picture ads are better targeted. And our observation is that an ad online that is highly personal is useful, and an ad that's not very targeted to you is pretty much useless. And the example I would offer is my television. So the television is on, and it shows the same shows that I saw yesterday. Well, it's a dumb TV. Why does it not know that I already saw that show? I mean, it's just a computer, right? It should be able to know that. And then it also repeats ads over and over again. Well, why doesn't it show me ads that are relevant to me? That, you know, ads for baby diapers, there's no baby in the house, there's no need for diapers. You know, that kind of stuff. And so changing that model to a more targeted advertising is what Google's about as a business.
And we've seen this in a big way on the web. One of the really interesting, often untold stories about Google is about the ad model, the advertising model that Google has developed, and its role in really changing the way that print advertising works and display advertising works online. And we're all waiting for that to come to television, to come to video. Do you have a prediction about when and how that might happen?
Well, we've been working on it, and these things are hard. You have to invent new technologies to do it. In television, we have a partnership with a satellite company where we have a set-top box, and we can actually do targeted ads to your set-top box. And we get a signal back as to whether the ad worked or not, and that's pretty promising. We had an ad business for print ads for newspapers because we tried to help them out, but we couldn't get enough information back about which ones were working to make the network and the auction that we run really work very well. So it's highly dependent on, same thing with radio. We had a radio ads business where we couldn't figure out well enough which radio ad to show, to have you hear on your radio to make it economically worthwhile.
Way in the back.
Yeah, question about internet power laws. You mentioned in a speech over a year ago, I think in Washington, that if you divided the total number of blogs by the total number of blog readers, you got a number that was pretty close to 1.
It's basically 100,000 blogs created a day. The average number of readers for that is 1. And it's actually 1.01 because the 0.01 is your mother, right?
So it hasn't gone down at all since then.
Go ahead with your question.
I think the gentleman earlier mentioned Google.org and the effort by Google to both have a motto of do no evil and accomplish social good. I'm wondering what your conclusions are with the years that you've been at investing through Google.org. And I guess there's a venture fund now and focus on renewables. I know is both a personal interest of yours there. Could you talk about all that?
The question is about Google.org, which is the philanthropic arm of Google.
We put together Google.org right after the IPO, and we funded it with about 1% of equity, so it's got a serious amount of money. And we started with a number of initiatives. The one that's had the biggest impact has been in the area of green and renewable power. So for example, we've been funding and working very hard for plug-in hybrids. And the neat thing about plug-in hybrids is basically if they have a larger battery, they use almost no gas most of the time, and they can use off-peak power. Another thing that we did is called the Google 2030 plan that was described. We came up with an architecture which basically, if we were just to decide to rebuild America's energy infrastructure by 2030, we would essentially not be reliant on foreign oil. And we would have also created a huge number of American high-paying jobs, created a whole bunch of export industries. And the net present value of that was a positive $200 billion. You actually make money to do this, which of course means it won't happen. And the economics are phenomenal. And so in order to do that, for example, you need to have a smart grid and intelligent garage solutions and so forth, all which we're working on with a number of partners. So that's an example of the kind of impact that we've been able to have. Another one that we're particularly proud of is called flu trends. What we do is we statistically look at the log behavior, anonymize the data, and we can predict, it looks like a flu outbreak 3 or 4 months before the authorities will predict it. Because when people get the symptoms of flu, they go to Google and they type them in. And we can essentially detect that. And we believe that this will save some number of tens of thousands of lives, and many more if there's the repetition of one of these horrific outbreaks like 1918 flu virus. So those are 2 examples, with many more coming.
I wonder if you've given any thought to how develop in a way where it could assist us in organizing ourselves politically as a global citizenry, global power.
The question is about how the internet can help people organize themselves politically as a global citizenry.
Well, you've actually done some research on this, as you're probably more the expert than I. Here's the rough problem. You watch television and somebody says, oh, well, we have 1 million visitors came to our site. And everybody goes, oh, well, that's exciting. Well, the problem is that we can't tell whether that 1 million visitors is 900,000 computers, 100,000 people, or whether it's 1 million people who were paid by some lobbyist to go talk to the site, or whether it's something that they made up because their IT person can't add all the websites correctly. We just don't know. And so when you start to think about trying to govern using the internet, you start to get really worried about misinformation, lobbying activities, spin, and that kind of stuff. And indeed, even lack of a paper trail for voting machines, which has been sort of something which people are very concerned about. So if you think of the notion of one person, one vote, and the traditional principles of democracy, you want to make sure that you're preserving some aspect of that, or just view it as input. And if you're an expert, you can view the sensing and so forth that goes on as input to you. But I would be very concerned if people started to say, here's the example that I was talking to Ed about earlier. Let's assume for purposes of argument that there was a discussion about whether smoking caused cancer. And as far as I can tell, in science, everyone agrees smoking is a primary cause of cancer. The only people who don't agree with that are the tobacco companies. So we do a survey of the average person on the internet. And the average person doesn't really understand all the details, and so they read the scientific literature, and then they read the opposing view. Well, the tobacco companies have a huge financial interest in making sure that the opposing view appears legitimate. And they will spend an asymmetric amount of information to pollute, if you will, the conversation from generally accepted, if you will, communal wisdom of this outcome. I'm using that because that's a very simple example that we can probably all agree with, but of course the real examples are much more pernicious. But my point is that you have to come up with systems which allow you to understand whether you're being gamed in order to effectively do these things.
This is one of, I think, the most important questions about how the internet will transform politics. Certainly, technology increases the quantity of discourse. The question is, can you use it to increase the quality, or at least to make it easier for people to understand what's happening, to get a better picture and to make better decisions. And that's a very hard problem. We have maybe a few inklings that it may be possible by thinking carefully about the way you design systems, about the way you design social software, which sort of nudges people in the direction of having conversations and forms of organization that are more likely to be fruitful. But there's a tremendous amount of research to be done in social science and technology design to understand how to make any progress on this issue. On the other hand, if we make even a small amount of progress at raising the level of quality of political and public discourse, it can have a tremendous benefit.
In an earlier talk today, was a mention that we should get away from the old method of governmental security intelligence and the spooks and the super secrecy among the agencies and so forth. Go more to a public information, such as can be found on the internet. Certainly you described some of Google's products that things internationally. What's your perspective on this?
The question is about whether technology will will change the way that governments gather information in the sense of intelligence. Will it be more like traditional intelligence gathering, or will it rely more on the use of public sources and use of the internet?
So transparency is really fundamental, I think, in modern governmental systems. And you can see it now, at least I can see it in hindsight, by understanding the motivations of people who have information. The information can be used to embarrass them. So there's a natural tendency of governments, regardless of political party, regardless of which country, to want to not make information transparent. It's only negative from their perspective. It can only ultimately be used to judge them, to embarrass them. It's seldom used to make them heroes, even after they retire from government. So I think modern functioning democracies have to have a bias for transparency, and they have to have laws that promote it. And we've seen in the United States some of the costs of that, and which we discussed at some length. From our perspective, transparency means publishing the information. And the bad information, as well as the good information, can all be worked through. Ed and his team wrote one of the most fundamental papers on transparency, and you can talk a little bit about why transparency was so important. But a simple example is, do you know what the government did this week? You think you do, because the media reported it, the people who live in the White House and so forth. But why don't we, for example, have all of the conferences that are public, they're published for attendance, or they're public, why are they not streamed onto the internet so that everybody can see what was going on? So people who are directly affected can have an opinion. They can lobby, or however our system works. So transparency is very fundamental. I'll give you another example, which is, I think, more controversial. President Bush decided to invade Iraq based on feedback that he was given based on secret information. Go through the thought experiment where that information was all public and it had all been debated. He still may have made that decision, but he would have done it in the background of an awful lot more conversation. So for things which are of major import, secrecy seems to be to almost always be the wrong answer. And public discussion, the difficulty, the framing of all of our debates, we seem to get to a better answer when the crowd is involved. Google is all about the wisdom of the crowds. There's a lot of evidence that wisdom of crowds produces better outcomes than experts, because the sum of people in almost all cases is better than a single decision maker.
Can you talk a little bit about how Google Health is doing and what the plans are for it, and maybe more broadly why healthcare is so resistant to information technology and what's happening?
The question is about Google Health and also about why the healthcare field seems might be resistant to adopting information technology in the same way as others.
So Google has a product called Google Health, which I'll talk about in a sec. Health care in America is 16% of GDP. It's roughly a third more expensive in terms of GDP percentage than in other industrialized countries. I'm not an expert on costs, but I know those numbers to be true, and I know that they're increasing. The current forecast indicates that they'll get to 20, 21, 22%, which becomes very, very difficult to sustain in for all sorts of reasons. I went to announce Google Health at a conference, and I gave a speech to 10,000 people, and I thought, God, the healthcare community is really, really large. And then I discovered it was the IT community, right? That this was the little, 1% of the community. So it gives you a sense of the scale of the healthcare industry. And in many cases, the IT approaches in healthcare have been hampered by secrecy, lack of common standards, proprietary standards, those sorts of things. Under the Bush administration, they worked very, very hard and I think effectively to open up many of those databases and to standardize, and the Obama administration has also indicated their inclination to do that. You need, again, some level of transparency with respect to, for example, healthcare codes, healthcare outcomes, and so forth, to really address this. One other observation about health: why is there not a Wikipedia for doctors? It goes something like this. Wikipedia is the collective world's intelligence, and it is a remarkable achievement by Jimmy Wales and that whole group. And we use Wikipedia all the time, and all of us do in one form or another. Imagine in medicine, the collective knowledge of outcomes, diagnoses, and so forth in a similar format. It would have a huge impact in terms of raising the base case for doctors up to a certain level, and that could be done relatively inexpensively. Google Health is an attempt to have personal health records that are controlled by the end user, and its growth rate is completely determined by whether we can plug into the existing healthcare IT systems, which we're working on.
With an almost infinite explosion of information now being processed, made available, representable is, of course, the big provider of information. Is there any possibility, and there's a way to know at this point, because you certainly assume you can see the trends and analyze them, and you could go either way. Does bad information drive out good information because of either human consumption patterns or because of simply the volume of information that's available? Or does it go the other way? Good information drive out bad information. Maybe people become more human race advances because the way they use information makes them more smarter. Or does it go the other way? And people that want to do intellectual things and develop human capacity kind of get defeated by the fact that human consumption of information at the universal level just drives everything down to the lowest level, in a sense.
The question is about whether in the information age, bad information drives out good information or vice versa.
I think it depends on your view of the public broadcasting system. If you fundamentally believe that PBS, which was, as you know, chartered to bring in this very high quality content, was it necessary? How do you think it played out? And so forth. This is not a new debate. The interests of the common man against those of the intellectuals, the interests of the governed versus the interests of the governed. We've deliberately not taken a position on this question. If you want to consume this stuff, we will happily serve it to you. And we try not to judge your tastes as being truly as terrible as we think they are. We just try not to. And we just don't think it's appropriate for us to judge that. I think it's a question for for the philosophers. I'm an optimist about information. I'm an optimist about the goodness of the human condition. That people really do want a better world. They do want social justice. They really do want health care for their children, and they don't want wars, and they don't want conflict, and they want safety, and all the kinds of things. And that this explosion of information allows us to see it more clearly, but ultimately it is a philosophical, political, cultural decision as to how we use it. We're going to continue to build these tools. The technology enables it, and it's up to humanity as a whole as to how we take advantage of it. I think the benefits of information so overwhelm the negative concerns, the bad speech and those sorts of things that are possible, are so overwhelmed by the access to information, the good speech, the fundamental benefits of using this to make the world a better place. To me, the answer is clear that it will be a better place because of it.
I think that is a beautiful place to stop. And I'd like to thank Eric and all of you for this conversation.
Thank you all.